there, welcome to Ridge Church. We're so glad that you're here with us, whether you're tuning in from right here in Charlotte, North Carolina, or from anywhere else. At Ridge Church, we know that life is messy, and we hope the message you're about to hear encourages you, challenges you, and reminds you that you're never alone. Thanks for listening in.
My name's Chris, and I get to be one of the pastors around here, so if I've not met you at some point, I'd love to do that. Now, let me go back to last week before we jump into this week. I saw the most focused group of people in a church that I have ever seen in my life. I actually thought like there would be like mild engagement with this, but we put this in the foyer last week. This is for those of you that didn't have the privilege, the beautiful privilege of experiencing the 80s and early 90s. This is a 3D picture, and some of you are like, no, it's just a bunch of dots. Oh, but is it? So this has got a hidden picture inside of it. Or at least so you thought. And so a lot of you were out in the foyer, and I said, hey, you guys kind of go out and check this thing out. And again, I thought a few people would engage, and I walked out after first and second service, and there's a huge crowd of people. Awkwardly, like everybody was looking, and no one was saying anything. They were all just staring, and I had this moment. In fact, if you're a second-time guest with us, thank you for powering through. I thought if our first-time guest walks in to this scene, they're going to think this is definitely a cult, right? There's a whole bunch of people silently staring at a non-picture in the foyer, and that was literally all that was happening. So if you braved the way to come back, and last week that was your first experience, congratulations to you, and thanks for braving it. Now, I have a confession to make, and it's cruel and unusual punishment, but there is no image in there, to which some of you are going, but I thought I saw an image in there, to which there's counselors for that, right? No, and some of you are like 3 seconds away from like full-on riot. No, there actually is an image in here. Would you guys like for me to show you what that image is? Okay, fine. That's fine with me. All right. So one person, anybody else want to see? Some of you are like, I don't know. What, so I will show you, but I will show you at the end of the message if you stay focused. This is wrong, isn't it? So one of the guys is going to come. They're going to remove this, and here's why. I've been communicating from stages for a long time, and I know that if I leave this up here while I'm doing a series on fatal distractions, none of you will hear anything that I say. So at the end, I'm going to tell you what's in that image, and we're going to show you. But in the meantime, I've got a little multiple choice for you. Who said it? Your focus is your reality. All right, here are the options. Was it Jesus? Always a good answer in church if you're unsure, for the record. Was it Martin Luther King Jr.? Was it Yoda? Or was it Confucius? So I want you guys to answer. Those of you in the cafe, I want you to play along, and those of you that are watching at home. So I want you to say, like, make some kind of noise. You know, you always, Ric Flair's the default if you need one. Woo! So which one do you think? How many of you think it was Jesus that said this? No takers? I set it up wrong, didn't I? You're like, oh, it's not it. How many of you think it was Martin Luther King? How many? You have to vote, by the way. How many of you think it was Yoda? A lot of Yoda. All right. How many of you think it was Confucius? So it's about even split. All right. The answer to this is your focus is your reality. May the force be with you. Listen, there was, I'm so sorry, but I'm not. So last service, my microphone went crazy the whole service, and I had visual demonstration and audible demonstration of distractions that I hope we don't have today. Now, it's interesting. There was a scripture that I read last week. There was Solomon that said something very similar to what Yoda said here, but in a different way, all in the right framework. He said this. He said, where there is no vision, and Solomon was known to be the wisest man to ever walk on the face of the earth. He said, where there's no vision, and you can just take that word vision and you can replace it with the word focus. Where there's no focus, the people perish. Now, we said last week, if you were here, that when he says perish in Hebrew, he's not talking about they literally die. It literally, the phrase there is they wander aimlessly. Where there is no focus, people wander aimlessly. Like envision them all. Vision 485, right? Envision, like it happens, and all of us have experienced this. Maybe this would, like, if you're honest, this is like the overarching statement over this moment in your life. You just feel like you're in a fog. Like, and maybe you haven't always felt that way, but you feel that way right now. Maybe you feel that way about a relationship, about your career, about your major in school. And here's the reality. When we feel that way, at the end of the day, there are distractions that are pulling at us. And we'll look at it again, the Latin word for distraction literally means to pull apart. And one of the things we looked at last week, there was this MIT neuroscientist that said we're not capable as humans of multitasking. Now, some of you women would argue that, none of us men in the room. Well, some of us would argue it, but we definitely can't multitask. Here's what he said. The brain can address multiple things at one time, but not with equal energy. In other words, you still energy and focus from one thing to give energy and focus to another thing. So you don't actually multitask, you just switch. And when we overestimate our ability or our capacity to multitask, what we end up doing is we end up losing focus, and we find ourselves in some portion or perhaps all of our life feeling aimless. And we all have felt that, and likely in some arena of our lives all are feeling that in some way today. So a little crowd engagement. I want you to take out your phone. Some of you already had it out. You know who you are. Take out your phone. I want you to do this in the cafe as well. If you have an Android, I don't know how to help you with this, but you can figure it out. If you have a flip phone, congratulations. I don't know where you found that, but that's awesome. But if you have an iPhone, if you kind of swipe up, it'll show you what apps you have open. All right. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to start closing out those apps. And as you do, I want you to count them. You don't have to do it out loud. This is not like public shaming, but I want you just to swipe out those apps. And as you're doing that, I'll tell you, when I did this, I had 12 open, which is a lot. I had an elder in the last service that had 35 open, for those of you that need a little grace. And then I had one of my staff to text me in between services and say they had 96 open. All right? So now that you can feel good about yourself, some of you are already focused back on me. So 5 or less, raise your hand. 10 or less, 10 or more, 10 or less, let's say. How many of you say 20? Let's jump to 20. Anybody 20? All right, 20. I see a 20. All right, I see a few of those. 25? You're still working, I see. That's like your thumb is going to be cramped. Will you still, 35? 40? Is it not good? 50? Oh yeah, it's you're gonna have to medicate that finger afterward. 60, let's just jump. She's still working. 80, 92. All right, she's still counting. Is there anybody else over here? You're still going. How many? 88. Do you feel good about yourself right now? You feel like you're the subject of a sermon illustration? You're doing great. Life's great. Remember, one of my elders was there and one of my staff. How many? 95. What was the one over here? 92. So we have a winner. I'm not sure what you won, but you won. Now, let me tell you something. Some of you are like, okay, all right. Here's what this does. Do you know what it does to your phone? It drains your battery down, like permanently. Like some of you are like, why do I charge my phone like for 2 hours and I have 5% battery charge? Because the more apps you have open, the more it drains your battery power. Let me just tell you the other thing that it does. And by the way, it does the same thing to our lives. When we have multiple, proverbial apps open in our mind, multiple things that we're doing, it drains the human battery. Your emotions, you get shorter, like all these things that happen, short with people in interactions, like it drains your battery. But here's the other thing. When you have all of this stuff open, like literally on your phone or physically in your life, if you can think about it metaphorically, here's what ends up happening. These distractions literally pull you apart. That is the definition of a distraction, to pull apart. And here's what ends up happening. You end up not being able to give all of yourself to anything or anyone. And I'm not just talking about the phone. Like, here's what I would say. Metaphorically, the phone is actually in social media, it's one of our biggest current distractions in our generation, one that's significantly different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But when we have distractions in our life, it drains our battery and it pulls our focus so that nothing gets all of us. There's a guy in our church that sent me this article. We're actually going to give you guys a link to it, whether you put it on social media or we've got a resource today that we're going to give you. But he wrote this article on the effect that our engagement with technology, if you're a parent, the effect it has on our kids. And it's pretty wild. And it makes sense, but it's not something that we think about, right? And so we're going to actually post that for you guys. But last week, and this is just a 2-part mini-series, and the more I got into it, I wish it was more. Nehemiah is actually probably my favorite book in the Old Testament. But we looked at the story of Nehemiah, and I do want to encourage you. Go back and read the story for yourself. We're kind of hitting some high points, giving a little bit of the big picture, and today we're going to look at a few details. But I would encourage you to read the whole story. But as we looked at the story of Nehemiah, just a little bit of background and bring you up to speed if you weren't here last week, remind you if you got distracted during my sermon last week. He is a Jewish exile, but he's living in the Persian Empire. Basically, he's not living in the land that was his own land, and he hears news that his homeland is in disrepair, that things aren't going well. And this is what the scriptures say in Nehemiah 1:3, those who survived the exile and are back in the province. In other words, some of them had been put into exile and they now were allowed to go back to their home. There was like a new regime, a new leadership that was over them, and they were allowed to go back home. The ones who are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem, which was built to protect them from the enemies, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. And what Nehemiah hears, we talked about last week, actually breaks his heart. We've all been there. Something you hear, something you see that you can't unhear, you can't unsee, and it actually breaks your heart. And we said this is what we call in church circles or in this kind of world, we call it a burden. Maybe you've heard that terminology. There's something that just kind of is heavy on your heart. It's that thing that like, it's a wrong that needs to be made right. It's something said that needs to be unsaid or dealt with. Like it's something that it's a problem that absolutely needs a solution, something that breaks your heart. And Nehemiah can't unsee what he's seen. And he hasn't seen it yet. He can't unhear, I should say, what he's heard about his homeland. And so Cyrus, the king at the time, he has no interest in the Jews being in his land. And so he releases him. He releases a wave of people before Nehemiah and then along with Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem and to start rebuilding the walls. In fact, he gives Nehemiah people, he gives Nehemiah resources, he gives him his blessing to go back to his homeland. And when Nehemiah gets back to build the walls, because again, this is his people, this is his heritage, this is his future. For him, this represents the promises of God that was made to be able to span generations. And it looks like it's going to end in his generation. And as he goes back, he's immediately met with resistance, both from the enemies around and from his people within. There's dissension inside, and there's attacks from the outside, and there's threats from the outside, and there's distractions at every turn. Like the human level of distractions in his life are unbelievable. And he has this really interesting response that if you've grown up in church, you've probably heard it before, pretty famous. His enemies keep trying to distract, and here's why. If he finishes these walls, then it means that they no longer can plunder. They can no longer take the wealth from the city. They no longer can marry from the city. Like it's going to change the rhythms of how the enemies around him operate. And so he says this as they come to him and keep trying to distract him, the enemies, they keep inviting him to meetings. He says, I'm carrying on a great project. Some translations say a good work or great work. He says, and I cannot go down. And they come to him 4 times, over and over and over again, a little bit nuance here and there. Hey, you got to come down and meet with us. And every time he says the same thing, I'm doing a great work. He's got a burden. This thing that he can't unsee. Like, I have to do this. Like, there's so much that hangs in the balance. He says, I cannot go down. I'm doing a good work. So here's what I want to do today. I want to bounce around a little bit. We're not even going to be kind of sequential, so we're going to move back and forth. Again, I would encourage you to go back and read the book of Nehemiah and see if you can kind of connect some of the dots. But I want to take a look at how Nehemiah responded to these distractions and see what we can kind of extrapolate. And I think there's a lot of practical stuff. Nehemiah is an incredible and brilliant leader. And how he engaged with these distractions, I think there's something for us to observe and learn as well. And so observation number 1, I'm going to give you 3 observations today from Nehemiah as he faced distractions is this. The first thing is this: we must check the source and we must dismiss the haters. When a distraction comes your way, we have to ask ourselves this question, like we have to pull back, because look, we're getting bombarded with them. It's not if, it's when. When distractions come our way, we have to ask ourselves, who's behind this? Like, is there a human behind it? And what is their motivation? So here Nehemiah is. 4 times this group of people have come to him, trying to distract him from finishing the wall. Every time he says the exact same thing. I'm not coming off the wall. I'm doing a good work. There's a problem that needs to be solved. And then finally, the enemies take it up a notch. They start to threaten him. And here's what they say. They say, you know what? We're going to go back to Cyrus, the king that gave you permission to restore a city within his area. Like, this is his domain. He's allowing you to do this. He gave you resources. They said, we're going to go back to Cyrus and we're going to tell him that your intentions are actually bad and that you want to build a city within his jurisdiction, that eventually you want to lead a rebellion. It's completely false. And it's fascinating. This is how Nehemiah responds. He says, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You ever said that to someone? You thought it. You ever said that? Like, I love the plain language. Like, you ever said that to your kids? Nothing like what you're saying is happening. Like somebody at work, your boss, you're like, that's not actually how it happened. He says, nothing like what you're saying is happening. You just made it up out of your head. This is what he says to his enemies. Immediately, Nehemiah recognizes that the haters in his life, the enemies in his life, these guys are the source of misinformation. Now, if Nehemiah was 13 or 14 or perhaps 15, he would say, these guys, their character was sus. I am not 13, 14, or 15, and as said, should never say that again. Some of you don't know what happened. Go ask your 13 or 14-year-old. He recognizes these guys, they don't have my best interest in mind. They're not for me. Like, it's interesting when there are haters in our life, when there are detractors, when there are people that are against us. They rarely give all the information. They love to be the source of misinformation. And here's how it goes. They'll give like part of the thing, but not the whole thing. Like, our news stations do this as well, by the way. Like, they give one piece of the narrative. In fact, if you'll watch the different news stations share the same story, it's like, wow, that feels like two radically different stories, because they'll pull out the one section that meets the narrative that they want someone to have. Social media does this as well, and they'll lead you on a journey. This is what our detractors do. This is what people who are not for you do. They'll pull out, like, imagine you have a conversation, and it's a conversation that has some truth in it, and it's a conversation that has some grace. Those people that are not for you, they'll pull out the part where you said truth, but they'll forget about the part where you talked about grace. It's misinformation. And here's what's interesting. When there are haters in our life, when there are people that are not for us, and they give part of the story, like sometimes even when you know what they're saying is not fully accurate or true, it can get in your head. Like, you're like, I don't think I did that, but maybe I did. It starts to mess with you. And you can start to doubt yourself. And so Nehemiah quickly, this is wise leadership, quickly and definitively, he dismisses these haters. There's this quote by Bob Goff. He's actually got a book that I highly recommend called Undistracted. If you've never read any of Bob's stuff or heard him speak, he's an incredible communicator. He's all over the place, but hilarious, and really, it's a really good book. But he says this, he says, I'm convinced that it is much easier for the enemy to keep us distracted than it is for him to take us out, or for it is to take us out. In other words, the enemy is going to use distractions. And guess what his primary distraction is? People. God primarily uses people, but the enemy does as well. He uses people to distract us. So here's what I want to give you this morning. This is going to be really helpful. I want to give you permission. Some of you need permission. In fact, I'm not giving you permission. The example and leadership of Nehemiah is giving you permission, and here's the permission I want to give you. Some of you have groups of people in your life. You have a representation in your life somewhere from your past or present. You have an individual in your life that you need the permission. You've given them a voice in your life, and you need permission, and I'm giving it to you, and Nehemiah is giving it to you, to dismiss them. They should no longer have a voice in your life. And they should no longer have a seat at your table, because they are not for you. Their intentions are not good. Now, I want to give a disclaimer, because some of you immediately are like, well, I got a whole list of people. Like a whole list, like Pastor said, I can dismiss them. And some of you have got like an epic haters list right now, and you're about to cancel all of the haters, all right? So before you get there, I just want to give you like two caveats to this, because I think this is real. Like, there are people that some of us years later, decades later, we're giving them a voice in our life, and they do not have our best interests at mind. There's some kind of self-motivation or some kind of unhealth, and we've got to dismiss it. But I'm telling you, here are the two caveats. Don't overreact. Like, you can't overreact. I remember a season in my life where in leadership, I didn't just feel, I was betrayed. This wasn't recent. This was many years ago. And I found myself engaging in the next conversation up and with the next person up, dragging what I had experienced with this one individual onto the page and assuming it for the next individual. I found myself, like in my subconscious, I was projecting suspicion immediately out of the gate. And I knew I was doing it and I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to be suspicious of everyone, but I didn't want to get burned again either. Like if you've ever been burned or betrayed, like it's painful, especially if it comes from someone, like the whole idea is usually you trust them, which is why you get burned. And so I remember I sat with a counselor in that season and said, how do I walk through this? How do I navigate? Because I can't just spend my life not trusting people, but I can't spend my life being naive. I ended up going as well to, and I'm so grateful that I've had friends at this, at different seasons of my life that I could go to. But I have a friend that was CEO of a really big company, and I had seen him go through this in a public space, to be burned and to be kind of left in a space where it would have been reasonable for him to doubt and be suspicious of everything and every business deal and everything moving forward. But somehow he kind of landed on his feet. And so I remember going to him and saying, hey, talk to me. Like, this is what happened. And I'm finding myself being suspicious of everyone, everything, and I don't want to live that way, so help me out. And he said this, it was simple, but I've never forgotten it. It's probably not original to him. Maybe you've heard it, but he said this. He said, Chris, you got to trust, but verify. Trust, but verify. And that was so helpful for me. Like we say in our culture, like our leadership culture, when it comes to like, if someone ever creates a gap, you know what I'm talking about? Like a trust gap, something happens in your home, at work, and there's a gap that's created. We want to do everything we can to put trust in that gap. We want to believe the best. Like, in other words, we say, I want to come up with the best possible explanation for their bad behavior, for their not showing up, whatever it is. But the other side of this is we don't have to be naive. We have to have wisdom about us. Yeah, you gotta trust, but maybe you ask yourself, do they have my best interests in mind? Are they acting on their own behalf only? Do they have an agenda? Do they have a track record of being dishonest? There are some people in our lives that we need to dismiss them. Second observation before we kind of move on from this, Nehemiah was not dismissing the voices of diversity. He was dismissing the voices of dissension. And there's a really big difference. There's a difference in the voices of people that are toxic. Like they're just bringing their hurt and their pain. Like, hurt people, right? And sometimes they're bringing sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. It's just, it goes with them where they are. And so they bring their hurt and their hurt ends up impacting you. But those hurters or haters or toxic people, like that's one category, but that's not the same as a voice of diversity. And here's why I'm saying this. We don't get to cancel all the people around us just because they don't look like us or talk like us. One of the healthiest things we can do for our life is to make sure there's diversity in the table of influence in our lives. People that don't look like us, they don't think like us, perhaps they don't vote like us, and they have a voice into our life. That makes us more holistic people. But again, I'm giving you permission based on Nehemiah. And some of you need this. There's someone that has a voice and a microphone or a seat at your table that you need to dismiss. He continues in verse 9. He says, they were all trying. He's talking about the enemies. They were trying to frighten us. They're thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. And then Nehemiah says, but I prayed. That's what you expect in a sermon, right? But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. It's fascinating to me. The first read of this, you don't pick it up, but this is mental and emotional warfare. Like these guys know they're trying to frighten us and they're thinking if we get afraid, then that's going to weaken us physically. They recognize, the enemies recognize, and so does Nehemiah, that there's a direct correlation between what's happening up here, what's happening in here, and what's happening through us physically. That our minds and our bodies are connected. And if we can get in there and make them doubt themselves, if we can make them afraid, then it's going to weaken them physically. They're not going to be able to hold up to the task. He was recognizing the connection. I have one of my kids, very driven, always asking me, Dad, like, how can I be better? How can I be better? Doesn't matter school, doesn't matter if it's sports, whatever. How can I be better? How can I get better at this thing? And one of the things I've said to all of our kids through the years, like, you get this sorted and you get this sorted, the physical comes later. You don't get those sorted, like you can be the best physical athlete or whatever it is, and you'll still fall apart. The Apostle Paul says the same thing. He says that we've got to take captive. This is how he frames it. We've got to take captive our thoughts, meaning there's this warfare that's going on. And Nehemiah recognizes it as well. And then he says this phrase, but I prayed. Like again, like it's kind of cliche, right? You come to church and you would think someone says, all right, how are you going to deal with distractions? Well, the pastor said, pray about it. Nehemiah said, pray about it. But we find this idea all throughout Nehemiah's leadership. He comes to a juncture. He doesn't just, and he's really smart. He comes to a juncture and he doesn't just strategize through it. He pulls back and says, but God, what would you have me do? And he prays. This is really important part of this story. Nehemiah, in my opinion, again, one of the most skillful leaders that we find in the entire scriptures. He is an incredible leader. He is a superb thinker. His strategy is unbelievable. His focus, as we're seeing in this series, is unbelievable. His determination, his work ethic. He is a top-notch leader. This is who he is. He's a capable leader, but he was keenly aware, and he was constantly aware that his skills and that his experience, that if I could say it this way, all he had that made up who he was, and it was a lot, was still not enough. We find this in the rhythm of his leadership. And he understands that the flip side of this coin, like the first part, he understands that those enemies, they're the ones that they're gonna bring the distortions and the distractions. They're gonna be the source of misinformation. But he recognizes the flip side of the coin, which is this, that God was a source of his strength. And listen, we would do well to learn this early and remind ourselves often that no matter how skilled we are, no matter how successful we are, no matter how affluent we are, those things will tempt us to think that we are more self-sufficient than we are. It's one of the things I love about Nehemiah. He was a highly skilled individual, but he knew that some of the tasks that were in front of him were bigger than him, and he would yield to who God is. Leads us to the second observation that I want to make about Nehemiah when it comes to distractions, and it's simply this. We must discern the difference between urgent and important. There are some distractions in our lives that are urgent, but they are not important. Like it's just frantic. Somebody's frantic, trying to own your attention. And if you were to pull back, if we're not careful, all the urgent things get in line and get us first. But some things are urgent, but they're just not important. They're not only not important in this moment, they're never going to be important. There are other things that are important, but they're not urgent. It doesn't have to be done right this moment. It can be done next week or next month. There are some things that are neither important or urgent, and there are some things that are both important and urgent. And for us, we have to be able to discern when distractions come our way in the form of a human or technology or whatever it is. We have to be able to discern the difference. I want you to watch what Nehemiah does. It's found in chapter 5. It says, now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. So like this isn't the enemies on the outside. Now this is internal. Some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. Like there's a bunch, we got a big family. That's what they're saying. And in order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we're mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine. These guys are basically saying, hey, you want us to work hard on the walls? Like we're suffering. Things are not going well. Still others were saying, and this is a great mark of leadership, that you don't just see it from your vantage point, you get at the vantage point of the person that's on the other side of the decisions you're making. He says, still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. And although we are of the same flesh and blood, our fellow Jews, like our people, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. They're having to become workforce for their fellow Jews. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. And then listen to what Nehemiah says. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. This is important. While he dismissed quickly the haters, the detractors, he dials up the voice of his people. So he recognized there's a difference. There's one group that, hey, their motives are not pure. They don't want what's best for me. They're not healthy. He dismisses them. But there's another group of people that he dials up. He amplifies their voice. And it's not only his people, but it is the marginalized. You'll find this throughout the scripture. One of the things we as believers should do, we should always turn up the voice of the marginalized in our life. We should always bend in the direction of the marginalized. He says in verse 7, I pondered them in my mind. He's a strategist. I pondered them in my mind, and I accused the nobles and the officials, and I told them, you're charging your own people interest. So I called together a large meeting, and I love this phrase, to deal with them. Nehemiah was like, I'm going to sort this out. I've seen the problem, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it right now. He didn't wait. This was important. This was urgent. He said, we're going to fix this, and he did. He stopped the slavery. He stopped them from charging interest against their own people, and he made them pay back the interest against their people. He's a great leader. He recognizes not all distractions are equal. This one is important and it's urgent. Now, if you are a parent, I want you to hear this next part. If you're a boss, like if you lead a group of people, if you're a coach, you have influence over a group of people, this is so important from Nehemiah's leadership. He understood that if he didn't get everybody on the inside working together, he understood that if he didn't get the inside sorted out, he had no chance of success against enemies on the outside. Like he understands that this good work, Nehemiah's like, I'm doing a good work. I can't come off the wall. But he comes off the wall to address this because he recognizes if I don't get this sorted, my family, my team, my employees, whatever the thing is, if I don't get this sorted, then it doesn't matter. The good work that needs to be done on the wall will never happen. Years ago, I was a perimeter church in Atlanta. The leader there made this quote that became kind of part of the fabric of our culture. We would talk about it in leadership. He looked at a group of church staff, and this is the question or a version of the question that he asked. He said, hey, when it comes to you guys, like what you have going on, is it worth exporting to the rest of the church? That's a great question. Like how you're handling conflict, like how you're being generous, how you're loving one another, how you're leading out in the mission, how you're leading your families. Like what you have, is it worth exporting? And he was saying the same thing as Nehemiah. He's like, hey, if you don't get this sorted, the rest of it will never work. This is important. But it's not just important, it's urgent. I heard Craig Groeschel pastors the largest church in U.S. history. He said this, he said, I knew this was the case. He said, but in COVID, he said, I recognized it in a unique and maybe an amplified way. He said, there's a difference in leadership and crisis leadership. In crisis leadership, there's a sense of urgency. It's like a fire. Like when there's a fire, you don't have a committee meeting to say, now, let's talk about how we want to address this fire. When there's a fire, you put out the fire. It reminded me when I was putting this together, I don't remember how long ago this was, but I have this bad habit. I like to heat things up in the oven on broil, which is probably not the right way to do it. Pizza, you name it, right? In fact, this story will reveal that it's probably not the right way to do it. But so I went by the oven one day, turned it on broil. I was going to put some pizza in, and I know it's pizza, and I'll tell you how I know it was pizza in just a second. So I turned the broil on, walked away to do something. I walked back past, and I saw smoke starting to pour out of our oven, which is not awesome. I'm gonna be honest, not an awesome moment. And I opened, I didn't know, hindsight's 20/20, and it's easy to judge me, and you can. It's fine. Lots of people do. But there's probably a lot of ways I could have handled this. But I saw smoke, and my instinct was to go and to open the oven. And when I did that, you guys know this, right? Oxygen fuels flames. So when I opened the oven door, the air came in, and a pizza box that was chilling in the oven, an empty one, caught on fire, like flames. And I do not advise this, but this is just what I did, not what you should do. I just reached in there and I grabbed it. So I grabbed this pizza box. I'm holding it underneath. It's flaming on the top. There's no pizza in it. It's just an empty box, which is curious. And so then I'm like, now what? So I run to the door, the front door. So I'm running to the door. So you guys remember what oxygen does to flames, right? So as I'm running, the flames going higher and higher. In my brain, it's 6 foot high. It probably wasn't. I got to the door and it was locked. Why do you lock your door when you're inside? My wife would say, that's my fault. I do that. So I have to unlock the door. And then I've still got this thing on my hand, flames going, and I throw it out on the porch. And when I do, it kind of flames out and I stomp on it and there's just a little bit of piece of box left. And then I turn around and every smoke detector, I think, in the entire neighborhood is going off. And there's just like smoke everywhere. And so we're opening up the doors. And then later, I literally asked my wife this week, I said, now remind me again, why was there a pizza box in the oven? She said, I think we had company coming over and it was on the counter, so I put it in there. I think that's how it went down. So that's how we're living at our house. I do marriage counseling, if any of you from personal experience of what to do and not do. But here's, this part's just added bonus. It's not really relevant to the message, but we had Dotson at the time, and this thing like created PTSD for this poor dog. Like all the doors were open because we're trying to get the smoke out, and like he's gone. I couldn't find him for 30 minutes. We're searching the neighborhood. Finally, I went upstairs and he left us a little surprise, if you know what I mean, like on our floor in our master bedroom. And then I found him hiding under the bed. So I know it's so sad. I created PTSD for my dog. So then from every time after that we would turn on the fan vent, he would immediately freak out, run up, drop us a little surprise, and hide under the bed. And that's the way that story went. Fire's urgent. Like you know this, right? There are other things that are both important and urgent. And Nehemiah recognizes this, and smart leaders do. And we have to ask ourselves, what kind of distraction is this? Is it important? Is it urgent? Is it both? Is it neither? What kind of distraction is it? Where is it coming from? Not all distractions require the same level of response for us at all times. Brings us to the third and final observation about distractions from Nehemiah. And it's this: we must remember our why. Verse 8, he says this. He says, they all. And when he's talking about they all, we're back to enemies now. We're no longer talking about inside, back to the enemies. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to stir up trouble against us. Like this is like they see that they're doing work, right? They're on the walls, they got hammers and tools, and they're working. They're like, hey, this is the perfect time. We're just going to roll up in there and we're going to attack them because they can't handle both things at the same time. And then again, listen to what it says. But we prayed, but they didn't just pray. They prayed to our God, and then it says we posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. In other words, they address it. Enemies are coming. They're trying to create fear. They're trying to create panic. They're trying to scatter us while we're weak, and we solve the problem. We address it, and they address it on two levels. One, they're like, you know what? We're going to fight. A few verses later, it says they stationed people with spears and bows and swords at every weak point of the wall. They said, hey, we're gonna fight, but also, hey, God, can you protect us? We're going to do all we can do. But God, will you do what we can? This is a great posture in life, by the way. We're going to do all that we can. We're not just sitting on the couch praying that God would act. We're doing all that we can, saying, God, will you do what we can't? So they address the problem, and the minute they address the problem, it feels like the problem changes. Continues in verse 10, it says, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers, and if you can just hear this in a ho-hum voice, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there's so much rubble, God, so much stuff. I don't want to clean my room. There's just so much stuff. I don't want to clean my desk. I don't want to clean out my inbox. Do you see how many there are? There's so many. Just whining. The strength of the laborers is given out, and there's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. They're like, we're just so tired. Like, if you can hear, like, if I'm Nehemiah, I'm like, all right, so which is it? Are you afraid of the enemies? Are you tired? Are you under-resourced? Like, what's happening? Because it feels like the minute we kind of get a plan, you switch over here and, oh, that wasn't the problem. Wasn't the enemies. We're just tired. So many rocks, so much stuff. It's that moment in life, and it happens to all of us, right? Where you got so much stuff coming at you that you don't even know what you're responding to anymore. Like, I don't know, I'm tired. I'm hungry, I'm distracted, I'm annoyed, I'm frustrated. Like, which is it? I don't know, it's all of them. Sometimes, this is so hard, when distractions come our way, we have to ask ourselves, what's really underneath it? Like, when we're feeling something, because sometimes it's like, when it feels like the target's moving, and what the problem is, we got to go, what's really underneath it? And Nehemiah knows, and I believe what was really underneath it for these guys, and Nehemiah believes this as well, was fear. They were afraid. Like, this was scary times. They could lose their lives. This was they were in a pinch. This is a critical time in their history. Nehemiah, I want you to watch what he says, because fear can paralyze us. says, after I looked things over, he's always watching. After I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Now, let me just tell you, if your friend ever comes to you and they say they're afraid, let me tell you what's not helpful. For you to look back at them and say, oh, don't be afraid. That's not helpful. If you're afraid, you know you're afraid. And if somebody says, hey, well, just don't be afraid, you're like, well, do you think I didn't think of that? I don't know how to not be afraid. That's the whole thing with fear. I don't know how to undo it. So when you're afraid, when you're feeling anxiety and someone says, don't be anxious or don't be afraid, you're like, well, I tried that. I don't know how to do that. But Nehemiah doesn't stop there. He doesn't just tell them, don't be afraid. He tells them, hey, here's the flip side of this. I want you to refocus. I want you to take the time, the energy, the focus that you're putting towards fear, and I want you to redirect it. And what he says, it's so simple, but man, is it profound. He says this, don't be afraid of them. Then he says this, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. I want you to remember the Lord. In other words, he's saying, don't just, look, it's not just about not being afraid. I want you to remember the Lord. And then he says, and fight. This is where, like, if you can imagine the scene. This is the scene. This is the Captain America scene. This is the big speech, right? He says, and fight for your families and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. Every time I read this verse, I hear it in the voice of William Wallace. Like it's the Braveheart moment. You know, he's in there. He's like, you know, they may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom. This is Nehemiah. He's rallying the troops. But what he does is so smart. He comes back to this idea that we've been talking about in this series of distractions. The human brain can't fully focus on multiple things. And so here's what he does. He says, hey, as long as you're fully focused on your fear, you're not going to be fully focused on God. And as long as you're fully focused on God, you're not going to be able to fully focus on your fear. Maybe one doesn't completely eliminate the other depending on the trauma and the situation of our life, but he's employing a tactic. He's not just telling them don't fear. He's saying recalibrate your focus. He said, you're hyper-focused on it. I'm just so afraid. I'm so insecure. I'm so anxious. He's saying, look, push your eyes, force your eyes. Maybe God will show up and help you and put wind behind your back, but force your eyes, turn your eyes towards God. And in this moment, he doesn't stop there by just telling them how. He says, and guys, remember your why. Because, listen, you got to remember why you started this thing to begin with. You got to remember why you got on the wall to begin with. Michael Hyatt says this. He says that when people lose their way, they lose their why. Like, or the beautiful part of the nature of how we are as humans, like when we lose focus, and let me phrase it this way, two different ways. When we stay focused, it brings strength and power to our lives. When we lose focus, we lose aim. We become aimless. When people lose their way, when they lose their way, they lose their why. He says, this is the idea of what Nehemiah is getting at. When things get hard, go back to your why. Like in marriage, when it's hard, why? Why did you go after it in the first place? Like, why did you not do these certain things for the sake of family? Like, I know it's hard right now. Why did you start being generous to begin with? I know it's hard and it's tight now. Why did you do that thing? Why did you start that job? Why did you move and do that thing? Go back to your why. In the moment where you're starting to forget, he says, go back to the burden. What's the thing? What's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the wrong that needs to be made right? And let it pull you back. Remind yourself, why did I ever get on the wall to begin with? What hangs in the balance? So let me put all these up here together. These are the three observations about distractions. We must check the sources and dismiss the haters. We must discern the difference between urgent and important. We must remember our why. There was a study, famous marshmallow study done. Some of you have seen remakes of the videos. I can't show the videos for copyright reasons, but this professor at Columbia International University named Walter Mischel did this study. And again, lots of videos have been made. We're going to post some of them later for you to see. But what he did was he took some kids and he put a marshmallow in front of him, and he said, hey, you can have this marshmallow. Like, I'm giving it to you. It's yours. But if you will wait 15 minutes, and you don't eat the marshmallow, then I'm going to give you a second marshmallow. But you have to wait the whole 15 minutes. Now, as this study unfolded, about a third of the kids immediately ate the marshmallow. Like the minute he walked out of the room, you know who you are in the room, right? There's adult versions of that. Like immediately they're like crushed it, right? There's a third of them that like made it part of the way. Like they like made it a few minutes and then not the whole way, or they ate a portion of the marshmallow. I don't know if they negotiated at the end, like, can I get a half of extra marshmallow? And then there was a third of them that actually made it all the way to the end, the 15 minutes. And here's what he said, part of his study. He said the kids that did this, the kids that walked in the room and immediately focused on the marshmallow, they were goners. Like, or better said, the marshmallow were goners, right? Like as long as they were focused on it, the marshmallow was going down. He said, if you go all the way to the third on the other side of the kids that actually made it the entire 15 minutes to get the other, he said, here's what they did. He said, very few of them focused on the marshmallow. The minute that they left the room, and the rooms were blank. There was nothing for them to play with, nothing for them to do or distract themselves. He said, but the kids that made it all the way, they would walk away from the marshmallow. They would sing a song. They would make up some game to play. They would do something that they would recalibrate their focus to something else. It's fascinating. It's actually a biblical principle. See it all throughout the scriptures. See it in the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah saying, hey, listen, it's not about just like willpower sometimes. It's like there's a mechanism where like I'm going to take the focus and the energy and the time I'm putting on this thing, and now I'm going to take that focus and energy and time, and I'm going to put it on this thing. We see it throughout the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, in terms of spiritual formation. That one of the ways that we form spiritually is to intentionally take our time and energy that's going to one thing and reallocate that time and energy and focus to another thing. There are a lot of examples. One of the most obvious is one called fasting. Now, some of you didn't grow up in a church at all. Some of you didn't grow up in churches that talked about fasting. Some of you thought that's just for the preachers and the professionals and like some couple of weird ladies that were really prayer warriors, and they did that. And then the rest of the people like we're not doing that. There's a lot of misconceptions around fasting, but it's actually a really healthy practice for our life spiritually. It's a fad now for people to do it with exercise, but before it was a fad, or do it with making themselves healthy. But now, but there's really a spiritual implication behind it. And the idea of fasting, I think it's been misused in a lot of ways. Fasting is not like going on a hunger strike against something and holding God hostage until he answers your prayer. It's not that. It's this idea of focus. It's saying, I'm going to take a season and I'm going to take those appetites that I have for food and I'm going to recalibrate. And I'm going to, and it may not just be food that we fast, but we're going to turn our attention to something else intentionally for a season. We're going to recalibrate the focus, and we're going to dial down one thing, and we're going to dial up the other. And here's what I want to do. I want to invite you to a challenge to be able to participate in this. There's something that starts this week that's known as Lent. This is something that's historically been done in the church for generations. I did not grow up in a church that practiced Lent in this way. And sometimes the religious systems and religious practices can feel a little bit clunky. But it starts on Ash Wednesday, which is this Wednesday. And it's 40 days. It goes right up until the Thursday before Good Friday. And so what people do during this season is they intentionally choose to fast something. To say, hey, you know what? I'm not just going to not eat. It's not about just removing something. It's about refocusing on something, but I'm going to put my time and energy, usually in this case, I'm going to remove something and I'm going to put my energy on the scriptures and on what God might say through the scriptures and on prayer and me talking to God and inviting God to speak to me. And I'm just telling you, some of you, if you do this, if I would say all of you if you do it, but those of you that will choose to do this, man, you may hear from God and experience God in a way that you never have in your life. Not because God is all of a sudden louder, but you're more focused. I'm convinced God is always speaking. I'm convinced that God is always active, but amidst the distractions, sometimes the noise of life, we just can't hear him. So here's a few samples. Here's a low-hanging fruit based on this series. One of the ways that you can fast is called a digital fast. You're like, oh, I'm not doing that. Imagine that, right? Now, for some of you, let me just say, you can't do it for work. Your boss is like, you're fired. You're like, well, my pastor said still fired, right? So you got to do it for work. I understand. But what if like from the time you got home until the time you went to bed, no social media? Ooh, tell your teenagers. Jim's up there telling them right now, by the way. Like, what if maybe it's just a certain thing like Instagram, or it's TikTok, or I'm not going to watch the videos because you just suck you into a dark hole, and 3 hours later you come out with a beard and you're like, oh, what happened to my life, right? So maybe it's just a portion. Maybe it's a thing. Maybe for you it's not that. Maybe it's Netflix. Say for 40 days, no Netflix, no movies. Maybe it is actual food. Maybe it's a portion. Maybe it's lunch. Maybe it's a certain time of the day. One of the most difficult fasts that I ever did, there's one called the Daniel fast. And basically, Daniel didn't eat the king's meat in order to show honor to God, and he ate vegetables only. I did one of those for 21 days. It's the only fast I've ever accidentally broken. Like, apparently pepperoni is not in the regimen for it. So that one, I would rather just not eat for 30 days than to do that. But here's what I'm telling you. It's not like some weird, practice to hurt yourself. It's like literally this thing, it can be liberating to break habits in your life and to refocus what you're doing and take that same time and energy and brain space and perhaps even money that was allocated to that thing and allocate it to something else. Allocate it to scripture, to prayer. And I'm telling you, this for 40 days could reframe the way you think about your life. We got a QR code. And we'll put this out today. We're calling it 40 Days of Focus. But there's some resources there. There's a reading plan. There's a couple of books, including one that walks you through a digital fast, the Daniel fast that I mentioned. And so if you want to engage with this, this is not a homework assignment. This is an invitation to recalibrate your life. And again, leads right up to Easter. And so I want to leave you with a thought from the author of Hebrews. The band's going to come out. I'm going to invite you to sing a song today that's special to me. This is what the author of Hebrews says. It says, let us throw off everything that hinders. I want you guys to say distractions. He says, I want you to get rid of distractions. They're there. He says, I want you to throw off everything that hinders, distracts, and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. The author of Hebrews is saying, hey guys, I know it's hard. Stay focused. Stay focused. To which you say, how? He goes on to tell us, he says, here's how. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. I think it's interesting that he didn't say fix. It's ongoing. This isn't one time at camp. This isn't one time when you got baptized. This isn't one time in that one series. He says, hey, look, your life is going to be full of distractions. It's like he's reaching into the future and he knows we're going to be listening in a world full of distractions. He says, your life is going to be full of distractions. And here's what you're going to do. Constantly turn your eyes to Jesus. Constantly fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of your faith. And for the joy, this is what he says about Jesus. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. In many ways, you and I were Jesus' why. In many ways, the cross was his wall. He said, I am not coming down because I'm doing a good work. It was you. It was me. He said, I'm not coming down. Like I'm dropping a rock in the pond that's going to have ripples into generations. Like his disciples didn't understand. They're like, Jesus, what are you doing? We're setting up a kingdom. They're running and hiding. All hell literally was breaking loose. Jesus knew they didn't understand the moment. He said, I'm not coming off the wall. I'm not coming off the cross because this is what I'm here for. This is my purpose. He stayed focused to the end. And here's what I would say. When Jesus becomes our why, and I hope he does for you some point in your journey, maybe today, maybe in recent weeks, maybe in the upcoming weeks, maybe this is your moment. When he becomes our why, this is what happens. Distractions start to lose their power over us as we constantly fix our eyes on Jesus. So the band's going to sing this song, just a chorus of it, called Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. When I was a kid, I grew up going to church 3-4 times a week. It was way too much. We were there a lot. But we used to sing hymns out of a hymn book, and this is one of them. Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. It's over 100 years old, and I love hymns for this reason. When you sing a hymn, you're singing something that generations of Christians have been singing. And it's this echo like to go, I'm going to turn my eyes towards you. Yeah, I don't understand this thing. Yes, this is hard, and I'm going to turn my eyes towards you. And this song talks about, and the things of this earth will grow strangely dim. Like it reframes our perspective. And it dials up Jesus and it lowers the things. They may not fully go away in this broken life, but man, when we turn our eyes towards Jesus, something profound happens. So I want you to stand with us, if you will, and I want to pray for us. And then we're going to just sing as we finish just a chorus of this song. Father, we got so many distractions, and you knew that. You knew it would be the case. You had so many distractions, so many reasons to come off the cross, but you didn't. I pray today, as we just make a little intentional effort together collectively to join with what Christians have been singing for over 100 years, we want to turn our eyes towards you, and we want you to reframe our lives within your perspective and how you see it. God, I pray that you'd allow us just to get a little glimpse of that today. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for listening today. If you're in the Charlotte or Matthews, North Carolina area, you're always invited to catch us online or join us in person at one of our 2 service experiences, 9:30 and 11 a.m. in the Ridge Auditorium or streaming live to our cafe venue. We hope to see you soon.